families and insulation. One is external resources that are beyond the family, things like financial resources and work and how that's been affected. The wellness and healthcare, the school system, as I mentioned, and social supports for adults and children. But in addition, and receiving less attention, are the internal resources that exist within every family. What kinds of roles and activities the children and the adults play, what kind of relationships they have with each other, and the centrality of the family or not in children's lives. Most of the work that I've read by governments and other agencies, NGOs and international agencies, assume that poor families around the world will have fewer resources during COVID, that they are the ones most at risk. And that is because they are focusing on the external resources, that poverty and health and lack of school, lack of government support will make a big difference in these families' lives. And as we will see, that is the case for the Yucatec Maya community. But they don't really pay much attention to the internal resources because they sort of assume that, like many psychologists do when talking about development, they assume that those internal resources will be the same across families, across communities, and across cultures. So this work really is to try to demonstrate that the internal resources vary widely in terms of what the family system is like, and that that has a cultural component to it, the cultural organization of children's everyday lives. The work that I'm talking about was done in the Yucatan. This is a map that shows mostly Mayan ruins. In case there are any archaeologists listening, I wanted to show that there is a case. You know, these Maya are distantly related to the ancient Maya, and while they identify themselves as Maya, they don't necessarily identify themselves as descendants of the people that built those stone pyramids. For the community that I work in is in the zone where corn traditionally was raised in milpas. Now many people also make money through the cash economy because of the coastal tourist zone producing jobs. The village has about 2,000 inhabitants. It's a relatively traditional rural village. All the rural villages are getting more modern day by day. And they have regular interaction with larger inland and coastal cities through work, services, shopping, visiting relatives that have moved there, etc. Here are a couple of pictures, old pictures of the village. The church is now orange. But still today, work is very demanding. Adults have a lot of work to do, including the work in the milpa, the work in gardens where they raise crops to sell. The household chores are still somewhat strenuous, and then many people, many men in particular, go and work on outside jobs during the week and return home on the weekends. Households can be 2 or 3 generations, and even when they're not 3 generations, usually the relatives live nearby. Most compounds have more than one house. They can be a mix of traditional and modern houses, and the large yards are also used as living space. Social events are organized around families, but community members all know each other. And Yucatec Maya is the most common language spoken, although many residents are bilingual in Spanish. My Maya is better than my Spanish since I've spent most of my time living in this village, so I speak Maya when I'm there, not Spanish. Children's everyday lives, as I have described them in the past, there are a few significant points I want to put in at the beginning. Children participate in most adult activities as legitimate participants when they're capable of doing the activity that is being done, or as observers in order to learn. Learning through observation is a very important component of what the children spend their time doing. And you can see these kids over on the right staring at something, happy to watch for a long period of time. Young children play when they are not capable of helping, if they want to, if they're not interested in watching. Children often take care of their younger siblings, even when they're playing. There's mandatory school through kindergarten through 6th grade, but there's optional preschool, junior high, and high school. So schooling has become, which is used by a lot of families. So schooling has become a significant activity that children do. And most children in the village speak Spanish and Maya. As they get more education, they tend to speak more Spanish and less Maya. So based on my extended field work, I have recently tried to characterize how the daily lives of children are organized by the cultural beliefs. These are often invisible, they're often not articulated by people, so it's complicated to get access to them. But they include things like their understandings of social privileges and obligations within the family, their children's roles and abilities, sometimes different by age or almost always different by age and sometimes by gender. The understanding of how children learn and develop. These are the understandings, the cultural understandings that go into the family structures that organize children's lives. In a recent article that I've referenced on the bottom of the slide, I have argued that there are 3 cultural principles that we can say organize children's daily activities: autonomy, belongingness, and family work. These actually work together as a system, but I've pulled them apart for analytical structure. And these are the 3 principles that I will be talking about in terms of families' experiences. So I'll go through each one briefly and try to characterize how autonomy and belongingness and work are seen in children's lives in the village, and then briefly how it's in contrast to middle-class United States families. The central question for autonomy is who motivates and organizes children's everyday activities. And for the Maya, and this is not true for all agricultural communities around the world, there is a consistent respect for children's agency and autonomy beginning at birth. By 1, certainly, children have a lot of autonomy in what they do. They are in charge of deciding what they do and how they will do it. This commitment is explicitly valued and respected by parents. It also is, they believe that this will facilitate children's learning. And it also mirrors the individual autonomy that you see in adults in their interactions with each other. Children have responsibility not only for what they do, but how they learn, and they are expected to start paying attention, to observe, and to practice as a way of learning without being told and without being praised. So parents support children's engagement, but they do not work to encourage it. They don't stimulate, they don't praise. The child comes to have a motivation within himself as he develops, as he grows older. In contrast to this, the middle-class US families have been characterized of having an ambiguous cultural narrative that makes autonomy a complicated topic, because the culture explicitly argues that children's independence and self-reliance are very important. But at the same time, they reward seeking help and attention from adults. So there is this complex notion that kids are supposed to be independent. That's why we put them in separate rooms to sleep, and that's why we encourage them to do all sorts of stuff. But the way that the parents support that independence is actually to undermine it, to make kids ask for help, seek attention, seek praise. And because of this, there's a large investment of parental resources in guidance, stimulation, and making sure the kids are happy. Happiness is a very important cultural value in the US. For belongingness, there are also some important differences. The fundamental question is, who are children's social partners and what are those relationships like? For the Yucatec Maya, for children as well as for adults, primary social partners are immediate and extended family. That includes play partners for children because play is usually carried out in mixed age groups of siblings and cousins. From infancy through old age, children have hierarchy of family social responsibility that they're embedded in, and their roles change within that hierarchy as they get older and more competent. So they are expected to receive care from everyone older and provide care for everyone younger, which means that a 3-year-old is expected to take care of the 1-year-old, but gets a lot of attention from everyone above him. A 12-year-old has more responsibility for more people below them. And as children reach an age of maybe middle childhood, they start transitioning into understanding not only their responsibilities to those younger than them, but also the burdens of the people older than them and how they can contribute to lighten those burdens. And in the comments that I'll read later, we see an example of that for a 6-year-old. For the middle-class US, there's a close dependent relationship with parents, not so much with siblings. But there is a very, very strong emphasis on same-aged peer friendship, that friendship is how children learn socially. It's what makes them happy. And so their fundamental social orientation toward other children is often with their peers, their friends, not with their siblings. For family work, we also see a big difference. What the fundamental question here is, what contributions are children expected to make and what motivates them to do so? The Yucatec Maya, because they're integrated into activities, they become integrated into family work as legitimate and valued participants. The older they get, the more competent they get, the more they spend their time doing engaged in family work. Sometimes that includes helping a parent to do something. Sometimes it is doing something independently. And often the child volunteers to do both of those. So they are asking to do work. As a parent myself, early on in my field work, I found this a pretty remarkable stance for children because my children never asked to do work. Their participation leads them to feel competent and connected without rewards. So they are motivated to become more and more integrated into the pattern of everyday life in the family and to contribute to the work that needs to be done. US children in the middle class are encouraged to pursue their own activities apart from family work. That often is play and to protect the child from having to bear responsibility. To be happy, to have fun. Parents find it easier to do family work, often without children's participation, often because they are asking children to participate before they're competent. So if you think about a 3-year-old helping their mother fold the laundry, the help might not be particularly helpful. And it might be harder to fold the laundry with the help of a 3-year-old than without it. So my children are different because they don't participate until they can actually do the work. The limited chores that are assigned for US children to do teach responsibility. They are motivated by that. Parents articulate that. And they often have to be motivated through rewards. So it's not about, I want to contribute to the family most of the time. It is, what's in it for me if I do this? So we see very different attitudes there. So we predicted that the reaction to the pandemic isolation would reflect these differences. As autonomous participants in the family's social and work activities, Yucatec Maya children should maintain their control over their daily lives, even when those daily lives have been reorganized, and be relatively content in isolation because they are with their primary social partners by being in the family, and because they have something productive to do that makes them feel good by contributing to work. Being dependent on parents to organize their personally motivated activities, in contrast, for the US children, and used to socializing with friends, they should find isolation much more disruptive and lean very heavily on parents to help them reorganize their lives or to cope with the stress that comes with it. So this is what we expected to find when we started the project. And spoiler alert, it is what we found when we actually talked to mothers. So we talked to 23 Yucatec Maya mothers in the village where I have done my work. We used a school teacher who is a close collaborator of mine to help us find 23 mothers who had 6-year-old children who were willing to talk to someone in Spanish, because that is the person who was conducting the interviews. and they were paid a small fee. 18 of those interviews were judged to be complete enough to use for analysis. We wanted to get a comparable sample of US mothers. We talked to 37 of them, asking if we could talk to them about their COVID experiences. Only 13 of those 37 agreed to be interviewed. I think this is a sign of stress, and also perhaps a sign that they were not motivated by any financial remuneration. But we have a very small sample. However, we have looked at reports from larger samples and interviews that have been done by NORC and others. And what our parents, these 13 parents, say is quite representative of middle-class US mothers in other reports. We conducted the semi-structured interviews, making sure that we covered the same topics with all the parents, but also making sure that there was space in the interview for them to volunteer things that we might not have asked about. Particularly focused on the 6-year-old children's everyday lives so that we would get some comparable information. And then they were coded by my colleague at Fullerton, 𝗭cie𝗹𝗹𝐿𝐵𝐺, and her graduate students. The reliability rate ranged from 80 to 92% for all the different categories that they coded for. That's the psychologist in me giving you all the methodology there. So now what I want to do is I want to go through these 3 topics: autonomy, belonging, and work, and talk about what the mothers said. I will do that in 2 ways. First of all, I'll give you numbers of how many mothers said something. And secondly, I will read you some quotations from the 2 different groups to give you more of a flavor of these differences. The numbers are, I think, important and telling because they often are very different across the 2 groups. And the Yucatec Maya numbers mirror the expectations we had based on the ethnography that I've done. But the conversations, the quotations from the conversations, give some flavor to the absolute distance between the 2 worlds of children. So we'll do both. In terms of everyday activities, we thought that children would be deciding what to do. And in fact, most mothers said, yes, the child decides what to do. And also the child volunteers to do work on a regular basis. And this was not this case for the US mothers. For the US mothers, their sense was 6-year-olds are way too young to decide what to do. I have to organize their lives. In terms of schooling, the 2 schooling situations were very different. For the Yucatec Maya, the school sent assignments through WhatsApp, which had to be downloaded and then done and then uploaded through WhatsApp and sent to the teacher with no instruction that came along with that. So even with no support from teachers in terms of organizing children's daily studying, the mothers, 2/3 of the mothers reported that the child does their schoolwork on their own. 6-year-olds are sitting at a table doing schoolwork on their own. And sometimes the child seeks help when they don't understand something. But we could not make the same comparison on whether the child does their own schoolwork because for all of the parents we talked to in the US, their children were in virtual school with a teacher present at particular hours. So there was no expectation that a child could do schoolwork on their own, that they had to have the teacher. And in addition to that, almost as many mothers said that their child sought parental help while doing the activity, in addition to the teacher. So now you have the teacher plus the mother sitting there and helping the 6-year-old child learn something. So now I would like to read a few quotations from both groups about autonomy in play and learning and in work. These pictures show, the upper picture shows kids playing out in the yard independently. Some of these pictures are ones taken during the pandemic sent to us by the parents. And that's the case of the little boy sitting at the table doing his homework. And the case of the little girl feeding the chickens. Those are pictures that the mothers sent in. You also see in the middle a little girl observing when something interesting is going on, as well as an older, a young woman with a baby also observing. And in the bottom picture, you see a little girl bringing her younger sibling back from the store, having been taken there to buy a treat. So for the mothers, in terms of talking about COVID, when we asked who decided who the child played with and what they did, they said, yes, she decides by herself who to play with, which children she wants to play with, and so she does it. Another said she plays by herself, sometimes at home, sometimes with my niece. She'll play with her. She decides who she plays with. And a third said they go out to play in the afternoon. They play with other kids nearby. These quotations show that the kids really are organizing their playtime. Another mother said about schooling, currently I have to help my husband. We have to tend the crops, and since he doesn't have much work right now, well, I wake up to make breakfast for my girls. When they're done eating, I tell them to wash the dishes. Then they do their schoolwork, read to learn more. So this is while the mother's away working, the kids are doing the work and the schoolwork. And when I come back, I look at what they haven't done and help and support them. I help the younger one more. That's the 6-year-old that we're talking about. Another mother who is staying home says, I see that she does her homework. She tells me it's time to do homework. So those are examples of children taking the initiative to both in their play life and in their schoolwork. For US mothers, one said, I still try and have them socializing out of the house versus staying inside the house. That's the mother organizing the socializing of the child. Another said, yes, we've tried to make sure they meet up with friends or go to the playground or whatever, but those to me are, like I said, they're still bubble social interactions because we pick them. So again, the mother is organizing the child's social life. In terms of school, we all have the books in one area and we go through, well, I go through the lesson plans. She's still young enough that I take that responsibility, she said. And another said, I'm like, it's right here. I've been looking at it because I need to remind them to get back on whatever class they're supposed to be doing right now. Yeah, so we have to print out a schedule with the synchronous parts highlighted. So we will consider that we have finished the discussion of autonomy in play, learning, and work. And I hope that both the numbers and the quotations convinced you that things were very different in terms of who is in charge of children's lives as they were reorganized. So now we're going to talk about children's belonging during the pandemic. And the first topic we looked at was the disruption of social patterns. Very few of the Maya mothers felt that their children's lives had been limited by the isolation. Even fewer thought that more family time was spent together. That's because they already spent a lot of time together as a family. But for the US, this was like a very important topic, particularly the limitation of social life. And that represents their access to their friends. And so then who they're playing with and what they spend their time doing. The Maya kids are mostly playing with their siblings and relatives, as we would expect. The American kids, not so much. They spend a lot of time playing with their parents. And surprising to us, they spent a lot of time on extracurricular activities. They play with other children more than they play with their own siblings who are sitting in the house where they are all isolated together. I find this a very odd pattern. If you're going to be stuck together as a family, I would have expected that there would have been even more play with siblings than we see here. And one would think that there was more play now than there would have been under normal circumstances. So these are pictures. Some of them are maybe 10 years old. Some of them are a couple of years old of kids being integrated in activities as they go along, just to give you a sense that there are always people around, always other children around. And in terms of the quotations that mother said, the Maya mother, Maya mother said, no, I don't let him play in public areas, just here at home. They play in the patio. Now they play at home together. And another said, well, when they want to, they sweep because I don't ask them to do it. But they will say, Mom, let me help you because you'll get too tired. And I love that they put in because the child is giving a reason. And the reason wanting to sweep is to help the mother, recognizing that the mother has a burden. And we'll come back to that in a little while. And then another Maya mother said, well, if I have to go somewhere, the children can just stay at home with my father-in-law. So there are lots of adults as well to provide childcare. And the child remains embedded in this world of family that they were embedded in before the pandemic. The American mothers said, I think just in general, we're spending a lot of time as a family, which we never did because my husband was always at work and he got home really late and he traveled a lot. So that part of our life has changed and we have dinner together. Another mother said, these kids have no friends. They're sad, they're depressed. There's not much. I mean, the activities really fall on my shoulders. And I'm going to become the 9-year-old friend, Luke wants me to jump on the trampoline with, he wants me to go surf with, he wants me to go play soccer with him because he doesn't get that interaction. Like there's practice, but they can't touch each other. So that's a mother standing in for the friends that are missing. Another mother reported that in terms of getting along with their sibling, they were more nervous and they're fighting more. And in terms of extracurriculars, one mother says she still has ballet 4 days a week. Now I find this incredible. This was in the fall that the mother was saying this. She still has ballet 4 days a week. Another said, I did have them play softball, like they did a softball practice league for 6 weeks. So that shows also a commitment to those kind of extracurricular activities. I suspect in part to give the mother a break from the intense interaction that they're having with their kids all of the time. They don't say that, but there was a very interesting article in the Washington Post by 2 academic parents who did a time allocation study of how often their kids interrupted them. And the average was every 3.5 minutes, the kids were interrupting the parents on average. Sometimes within 30 seconds, there would be, I see some of you smiling. Sometimes there would be like an interruption of an interruption because there were 2 kids, right? So one kid would interrupt and the other kid would interrupt. And that would be, it looked crazy, totally crazy. And when you think about the autonomy that the kids have, it's quite profound. Okay. Now about children's family work during the pandemic. The amount of work that children are doing. The mothers, some mothers said that they have had more work and that they could use some more help than they're already getting. But many more said that the child is now helping more. And this was a recurrent theme, in part because the child was home and not only had the time, but had the interest to learn how to do new things. None of them said it was harder to get the child to help during the pandemic than beforehand. For the US mothers, about 1/4 of them said it was harder to get children to help, and largely because the children were stressed. Some children were helping more, but many more mothers felt overwhelmed and like they could use more help. And that's in part because parenting is a more intensive activity on the part of the US mothers. So during isolation, that work went up, but also just cleaning up the house and whatever. Children offered to help. 2/3 of the Maya mothers said that children offered to help, and only a couple said that the child needs to be asked. Many fewer said the child offered to help, and somewhat more American mothers said that the child needs to be asked. So I now have some quotations about children's work. In the top left, a little boy is feeding some chickens. It's a little hard to see. That's a pandemic photo submitted by a mother. In the next picture down, 2 kids are in the fields with, I think, their grandmother. That also was submitted by a parent. The bottom right-hand picture was submitted by, or actually both on the right were submitted by parents. The little boy posing for the camera, but feeding a pig and washing a couple of stools. The picture in the middle is from a long time ago, and a little girl is doing her sweeping, but I put that in since the little girl had talked about, well, the mother talked about the little girl sweeping. So the Maya mothers for work said, being home, they realize all the stuff that gets done at home, because before they would be gone at school. And now they realize the responsibilities and learning about that because they don't go out. Many mothers talked about things that their children had learned to do during the pandemic. Another mother said, yes, she says she wants to help, like, for example, helping at home. And since she's still young, that's 6 years old, she tells me, Mom, I want to help you, or Mom, I can wash, something that she can help with, wash, bring, stuff like that. She helps me a bit. So you see that the mother recognizes that the child's capacities are limited, that she can't do a lot, but she is volunteering to do what she can do. The last mother that I'm going to quote said, when the sun comes up, this is the kid I'd like to have in my house. When the sun comes up at 6:30 in the morning, he's already awake and says, open the door, Mom. I have to go let the chickens out to help them grow. He grabs the food and begins to give it to the littlest chickens. I don't have to tell him things. He does it quickly all by himself. He runs to do them without being told. Before I wake up, he's awake. In contrast, the American mothers, one said, they're home more, so there's, it's more there's to do. Right, like there's more cleaning up if you're always home. Not that the children are doing that, the parents doing it. But no, the expectation that they get things done hasn't changed. Another said, no, they absolutely have to be reminded. They don't like doing the chores, but they do them. And it's like, hey, could you help with this? And then she'll help. Another said, well, she has to take the silverware from the dishwasher to the door, and it's to the drawer, and it's supposed to be feeding the cat, but she doesn't always remember to do that. And a final one said, I also have some chores for at least him to do, because mostly he wants to earn money so he can buy things for video games and stuff like that. So in none of these do you see the notion that the child is feeling a responsibility to participate in work in order to help the parent. Okay, then the last thing we did was we asked for open-ended answers to what had been hard and what had been positive about and what they had been worried about during the pandemic. And here you see the force of the external factors coming into play in the Maya lives. Most of them, everyone had experienced job loss. Many of them by the fall were still experiencing job loss and extreme poverty. Many of them had school concerns, and those were balanced between not knowing how to do the tutoring when the kids needed help and finding the extra money to have credit on the phone to be able to download the work that came in from the teachers or to upload it, or internet it for older kids. Very few had pandemic fears. But you see that the American mothers had none of that. External factors in this sample of middle-class parents was not an issue. There was no job loss among these people. School was taken care of by the school, and they also did not have many pandemic fears. So a very different scenario in terms of external factors. But now we're going to move to the internal factors and what they worried about. So you can see for the Maya, they didn't have a lot of internal factors they were worried about. They did report that they themselves had some stress. Most of that stress came from not having money and not having food to put on the table, not stress about what the kids were demanding of them or what they were hoping to give to the children. For the US sample, though, this is what people worried about. They worried about their child's well-being, the fact that they weren't having enough social interactions, that is, with friends. They themselves were stressed. Half of them were characterizing it as burnout. They were very tired. And they also worried about disappointing the child. In terms of worrying about the children's well-being in a little more detail, most of the Maya mothers were worried about whether the kids were learning enough and whether they were providing enough support for their kids. They're not used to being tutors. They're used to having school handled by the teachers. So this was a huge change for them. They weren't particularly worried about not interacting with others. No one thought their social emotional development was at risk. Most of the kids were not bored because there's stuff to do. One parent said they were missing major events. Those were religious activities. And two mothers said they had no concerns at all about their children's well-being. In contrast, the US mothers are not worried about school. They're incredibly worried about children's lack of social interaction, even to the level of thinking that there's going to be permanent developmental risk because the children are not interacting with their friends. Half the kids are bored. Some mothers are worried about missing major events, and all the mothers found something to worry about in terms of the child's well-being. So here we have pictures of food distribution early on in the pandemic, when literally no one had any food. They were hungry, going hungry, and putting no food on the table for the kids. A picture that a mother submitted of where she's sitting and helping her kid with her schoolwork, and then a picture of a little boy working out in the fields. And I suspect that this little boy did not go out in the fields before the pandemic. So in terms of giving some flavor to these numbers, the Maya mothers, the first Maya mother said, well, the hardest thing is not feeding my girls like before. Well, because there's not enough money to buy what they ate before. It's, well, the hardest for me. Yes, yes, I do feed them. This was in the fall, in November, so there was some money now coming in. Yes, yes, I do feed them, but not like before. But sometimes I don't have any. I tell them, I hug them, and I tell them, I don't have any. When I have some, I will give it to you. I tell them, you're only a girl, you may not understand. And then I say, but when I have it, I will give it to you. So this, I love this quotation because it shows the fact that the parent's not afraid to tell the child the reality. They're not trying to make a spin on it to keep the child from being worried. They recognize that the child may not be able to understand, but they, with love, say, I don't have it, I can't give it to you. When I have it, I'll give it to you. Very matter of fact. Another said, well, my biggest challenge is to occupy the place of a teacher around here, helping the child with homework, because there are some things that we don't understand, and I have to find a way to help him. Another said about school, I see it's challenging, more challenging, because sometimes I still don't understand something to be able to help them more. And then we don't have the money to afford internet for them to do their homework. We don't have any. That's why I see it a bit complicated. When we get that way, we have to sell something, do something to afford internet or put money on the phone so they can do their homework. So maintaining access to WhatsApp is not a very expensive activity, but for these mothers, that little amount of money looms very large. Positively, they said, I feel happy here with my daughters because I know being at home with them, well, nothing will happen to them. No, they won't get any disease because I'm taking care of them here in my house. And another articulated this idea that they're learning more. Before, he didn't know because he'd come back from school and had to do schoolwork. And well, now he's learned to do the work we do out in the fields. Another mother reported that her older children, not the 6-year-old, had learned how to make tortillas, because before they'd always come home and the tortillas had been made, and now they were sitting around all day and they had come to learn to make tortillas. A rite of passage for women. American mothers, on the other hand, this is what they were worried about. I think socially it's had the biggest impact on them, like they missed their friends. Another said, I worry about her mental health. I worry that she's not getting to play with friends as much and have that childhood experience, and that like a large chunk of her life is going by and she's not able to be with friends. These quotations show the centrality of friendship for these, not just for the children, but for the parents' understanding of their child's well-being. Another said, as a parent, I think that at times it's been hard to have to disappoint my kids about the things we can't do and that they can't do. That's been what I've considered to be the hardest thing about this as a parent. And in terms of burnout and being stressed, one mother said, well, if I'm super stressed, then I'm a lot less patient and a lot more on edge, a lot less tolerant of, inappropriate behavior or whatever. But a lot of it's just being aware of it and taking care of the stress. I think that overall my patience is a lot lower. And finally, one said, I've had a lot less time for myself and doing things that I wanted or should be doing just because I've, had to monitor school and stuff like that. So I think that would be the biggest thing, is that the time I had that I was doing things, either for the household or for myself, have shifted. This brings up the issue that not only did the kids have a life outside the family, but so did mothers, and the mothers lost that life as well as the kids. Okay, so in conclusion, I want to say that I think that the lessons that we've learned from looking at these pandemic experiences include that the Maya vulnerabilities are really only from the outside. The lack of money and the lack of schooling are the things that have been difficult for the Maya mothers. And they have shown incredible strength and resilience within the family in coping not only with those external difficulties, but in terms of coping with the isolation that is also isolation for them. All these kids went to school before, but they have been able to readjust their expectations and their patterns in a way that seems really pretty easy. Middle-class US vulnerability from the disruption of family patterns is much stronger. And the US families are suffering. They're suffering from the isolation, from the lack of outside activities, and the pressure to spend all that time together in the house. And so in this sense, poverty doesn't predict the experiences that we see because of these internal factors being orthogonal to issues from the external factors. The study also did what we had hoped it would do to show to light up the cultural organization patterns in family life, that children's everyday activities are organized by cultural understandings, and they differ a lot. And in that sense, culture has consequences for their everyday lives, their development and learning in ways that we often are not able to see under normal circumstances. And the pandemic and watching families adjust to the pandemic has made those much clearer. So I'd like to say thank you to all the mothers. I think it was really hard for the Maya mothers to talk on the phone to a stranger in Spanish, and yet they were willing to do so. The American mothers were less willing to talk in their own language on a medium that they were totally familiar with. I'd like to thank Maestro 𝗖ecie 𝗵𝗿𝗀𝗀 to help us find the Maya mothers, which I would not have been able to do from a distance. And then my collaborators are Dr. Alcala from Fullerton, who did the interviews, and her graduate students who coded them, and Dr. Lindsay Richland from Irvine, who has helped provide some of the American mothers and has worked with us as we work through the results. So with that, I am happy to take questions, comments. I look forward to hearing what you think.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating talk, and highly relevant, obviously. So we don't have any questions in the chat, so we'll just go straight to the audience. So I see that Ian has a question, and then Edgar and Diana. So go ahead, Ian.
I just had more of a comment, and I wanted to say that I just really enjoyed this talk today. I actually, this is like sort of the first time I've been able to get sort of a non-US perspective on what the experience of COVID has been like, and the fact that it was a Mayan perspective is even more special. But I just thought this was a really fascinating talk today, and yeah, I mean, there was like a lot of nodding that went on, like a lot of these results made a lot of sense to me, and it did just make me think about just sort of the vulnerability of the sort of model that we have in the United States and the resiliency of other models out there. But one thing that I thought, again, this is just a comment, but one thing that I really hadn't thought too much about before was about this issue of how in the United States, a lot of play friends are same aged, right? And that has become like a real vulnerability for people when they can't go to school. They've lost their entire like sort of childhood social network, and I hadn't really considered the fact that that's not how it is in other places. So anyway, that was just one of many things that I thought was really fascinating. Thanks very much for your talk.
I think it's interesting. To me, it's as if this study shows me more about American families than Yucatec Maya families. So I had to understand the Yucatec Maya families to understand how it was working there. But in fact, since it's the vulnerabilities that show up, it's not terribly surprising that if you have no money and you have not gone to school yourself, it is difficult to take care of your kids when you have no money and you're asked to be their teachers. That's a given. And that's what most of the agencies notice. But to me, it did in showing the strength of the Maya family, it only underscored the weaknesses that exist in the American families.
Thanks again for your talk.
Thank you very much for your comments.
Thanks. Let's see, Edwin, did you have a question? No, okay. I thought I saw that hand up. Diana, did you have a question?
Oh, I was just applauding actually. So
Oh,
thank you
okay.
for the talk. 𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫. I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you.
Let's see. I had a question actually, or Ozzy, did you have a question? No, okay. Well, I have a bunch of questions. I also
You only get one or two. You can't, you know, just because
Okay.
you're the moderator doesn't mean you can.
I thought this was fascinating, and like Ian, a lot of it you know, hit home, not always in the most comfortable way. And I the first question I wanted to ask is, you know, what kinds of you know, obviously you have to you know, simplify some to make this comparison, but I'm curious if you could talk now a little bit about the kinds of diversity that you find both in the Yucatan and in the US in terms of these models of participation and work in the household, and whether you thought that these, you know, sort of within a single community, you saw any variability in the impacts of COVID therein in relation to that.
Well, you see in the numbers that not every mother in the Maya group answered the same way or chose to talk about the same topics. But I think that those three principles of autonomy and belongingness and commitment to family work actually are pretty universal. It is a rare child that doesn't exhibit those three things. And because of the dynamics of the family or the particular preoccupations of the mother, she might or might not have talked about everything exactly the same. Obviously, there's a lot more diversity in the US as a whole, and even that's why we chose to try to narrow it down to a particular group of families. Even within middle-class families, there's a lot of diversity, much more diversity than you see among the Maya. But some of these things are pretty constant. Kids don't work a lot. Kids spend their time with their friends, not with their family. That's what they value. And if they are spending time with their family, they're spending time with their parents. And in that complex, independent and yet dependent role that they have with their parents. And they don't make a lot of the decisions. They think they make a lot of decisions about what they do, but often they're being manipulated by their parents, as in, oh, honey, would you like your milk on the left or the right? The child is choosing, but not much. So I think there is some consistency there. The parents had also, they were not affected by the external resource pressures. They didn't lose their jobs, and they all had schooling presented. So there is some consistency there, but obviously more diversity there than there is in this one small community for the Maya.
Thank you. Loa Trexler had a question. You want to unmute and ask your question?
Well, hi, Suzanne. Thanks for
Hi,
your
Loa.
presentation.
Thank you.
And my question really tied into what you were just speaking about. It was wondering how much variation then comes about in Mayan towns or neighborhoods where the parents and all of the parents and households in an area are much more tied in with the urban lifestyle and other pressures that kind of come along with that. Is it likely that many of these indications are going to shift in ways that are more similar to the US middle class experiences, or is it still that sense of resilience and autonomy so very different in terms of the lives and the childhood lives in Yucatan that it's pretty hard to move it away from those documented kind of responses?
So that's a really interesting question, because there is a lot of change in the culture, even in these small villages. The shift has been in work, largely away from growing corn and being on an annual slash and burn cycle, and toward cash economy. I wrote an article about 20 years ago on the cash economy, and I argued then that it had not made much difference in the socialization of children, that children's lives had changed in the sense that they did not drop out of school and go behind their fathers to the cornfields as much. But the principles of what was important, and I didn't have these 3 principles 20 years ago, but these principles were still there. And I would say the same is true now. There is even more change that has happened in the village. And then even so when people move from the village to a larger town, the children have perhaps more commitment to consumption because there's more money in the household. But barring that, when they come and visit their cousins in the village, they're acting the same as the other kids in many, many ways, in terms of deciding what to do themselves, in terms of taking care of younger kids and knowing that they'll get help from the older kids, and maybe less interested in work, but then they're busier in town. So there's less time to do work. They have more time in school, and they probably do have some extracurricular activities when it's not COVID time. So to me, the surprise is that there isn't more change, given the way that the economy and the workload has changed. These are socialization's been shown across cultures to be pretty conservative in terms of its how slowly it changes. So I would say less change than you might expect, but I cannot say no change at all. Lives for everybody are easier than they were 40 years ago, for the adults and for the kids. Everybody does less work, but the work that is in the house, the children are still eager to engage in. And I don't know how many of you have kids, but to be able to say that a child is eager to help is really a profound cultural difference. As it is to say that parents are willing to let kids make decisions on their own, even when they're bad decisions, and to organize their time in ways that you would not like to see them organizing their time, assuming that they will eventually come around and make the right choices.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Loa.
Thanks. Great question. Suzanne Gaskins.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I guess I work in the Amazon, and a lot of this stuff is very similar. You know, kids drink beer, kids vote. If you're going to vote in some election, little kids vote. I mean, obviously not at the national level, but so a lot of it rang true. And I loved your description of the middle class in the US. And I guess what dawns on me, or what it made me think of, is, you know, autonomy is one of our core ideas of individualism in the US. And yet we also have this idea of childhood, where it's supposed to take a really long time to develop it, and self-development happens in childhood. And I don't know, I think it's linked with class. I'm trying to think of who it was, which sociological studies I'm thinking of, and I can't think of the names, but that the middle class, it's a status marker to have a longer childhood. The longer you keep your kids dependent, the higher status you are. So I guess I'm wondering, what are ideas of childhood for the Maya? I mean, is there some kind of, is that a period of time where anything special happens, or is it not really thought of that way?
Well, I think the goal is for children to be active in the adult world as quickly as possible, and that's limited by their capabilities and their understanding. So there is a sense of protecting young children because they cannot understand the more complex things that are organizing their lives. It's a very common thing to say, he doesn't understand. And that's a way of excusing inappropriate behavior or inappropriate goals or whatever. But there is, and children are precious. They're precious in every culture around the world. They're the treasures, they're the hope for the future. And that's true, I think, everywhere. So there is that sense as well. But the notion that there needs to be this bubble around children where they are spending their time doing irrelevant things under inaccurate rules for what they're growing up to be, that doesn't exist. Kids, as we saw that mother explaining that she just didn't have the money for food, and that she didn't know if her kid could understand it, but that she loved her, and that when she had more money, she would get more food. That's very realistic. And a lot of mothers gave us examples of that kind of talking straight to the kids. Whereas the American mothers are talking about, oh, I turn off the news, I don't tell them all the trouble we're having, they're protecting the children from the reality. And that's a very different position. And it goes along with the notion that children's work is play in the US, whereas for the Maya, play is what you do when you can't do something productive. It's not seen as a productive activity. So there's a very big difference. The Maya kids, one reason why they did so well in the households during the pandemic is because they weren't used to a world that was constructed for them. They were used to participating in the real world. So whatever the real world was inside that household, the Maya kids had a role. And they weren't, in some sense, the US kids' fantasy world was deconstructed by the pandemic. And so then they had no world. They just had a vacuum, you know? And the Maya kids didn't lose their world, because their world was the same world as the parents, and it focused on the family. And so things changed. Some things were hard. It was scary. Not having food is a horrible thing. I don't want to minimize any of that. But the fundamental rules of who I am and what counts didn't really change for the Maya kids. And the American kids' worlds, the parents are trying so hard to keep the bubble from bursting during the pandemic. But it's the parents doing that work. And the kid probably just notices the fact that it's not as great a bubble as it used to be.
Yeah, so I wonder, what are we doing? What are we developing in that bubble?
Yeah, well, that's another topic.
Yeah, well,
but, you know, and there are some positive things that are developed, and there are probably some negative things that are developed in that bubble. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you said not understanding, it's exactly the Tupian phrase that lowland people in Brazil use. Kids don't understand. It's so interesting. There's such they're so close, really, geographically. And
there's a lot of similarities about childhood socialization throughout the New World.
Yeah.
It is not the same as in Africa or in Asia always, but with up and down, north and south, there are a lot of similarities in terms of children working and contributing toward work, learning through observation, having this sense of, the other thing that they say a lot is, oh, the poor thing. And it goes along with not understanding. They are a poor thing because they don't understand. And so the pity is given to them, but with the understanding that they're on their way. And that little by little, they will come to understand. The way they understand is by watching the real world in front of them and participating when they are competent to do so. It's a different model of childhood, for sure.
I have another question that sort of riffs on that comparative perspective that you're talking about. I'm wondering how you see this in relationship to like the work on cooperation and the innateness of cooperation in humans. I'm thinking of like Tomasello's work and the other work that he cites and interacts with, because it seems, you know, just in my own observations, for example, of my daughter, that when she was younger, she seemed more interested in helping, and it seemed like, you know, it just sort of came natural. She wanted to be involved in the things that were going on, but as she socialized more with other kids, and it's, I'm sure also, you know, things that I do that I learned, you know, growing up in the society as well, she became less and less interested, to the point that, you know, it's that thing that you're talking about, where it's, you know, rare to volunteer wanting to work and help out in some situations, not in others. But I'm just wondering if you've seen any kind of you know, universal versus particular pattern in how they interact in you know, ontogenetically.
Well, there is quite a bit of research done on kids age 4 that they do volunteer to help. Tomasello does these experiments where with this handle, but the doors are closed, and how many kids will come and open the door, and 3-year-olds will all open the door. So it appears that you have to think about demands that are made on a kid, how they enter into the social world as a participant in the first place. And every culture sets its ground rules about what's allowed. So it happens to be that US culture sets ground rules that it's kind of cute to let 3-year-olds help, but really you want them out of the way as soon as possible. And you want to protect them in this social bubble. So both things are true. Something that is often misunderstood about my research is that all kids should be able to do all the work, and that that's the way to get your kids to be engaged. And the Maya very clearly have very little patience for a kid trying to do something that he's not able to do. They don't come in and swoop in and help them. They might scaffold a tiny bit. So if a child is more or less competent, but having some trouble, they will make a comment or change something so that the child can be more successful. But a 3-year-old who really can't do anything, we saw that one mother that said the 6-year-old couldn't do very much. She could help a little, but she couldn't help much. So she could wash or she could do this, but she's not going to give her laundry to do because she can't do the laundry. So there is this sense that you might, the Maya parents are not saying, oh, our kids already are helping, we want them to help more. That tends to be the American approach. Isn't it wonderful that my kid wants to help with the laundry, even though it takes me twice as long when they help me? So it's a different dynamic than that. It's not that the Maya families say we are going to keep this helping going. It is more that they grow into an understanding of their role and responsibilities within the household. And that when they adopt those, they can become helpful it's sort of like helpfulness is transformed from just being like, this is a way I engage with people, to this is a way I contribute to the family. And so it's a more mature notion of what helping is. And one way they contribute to the family is if they can't do it, they go away and play. And they don't have to always be sent out. They can judge that they can't be helpful. And so they go and do something else. But that's in fact being helpful, because if you have that many kids around, in the old days, you had 10 kids. You didn't really need all 10 kids there watching you do everything. You really wanted some of them to go away.
Thank you.
Mhm.
�씨.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this as well. I had a question about if you could comment or maybe speculate about how this difference in socialization impacts adults. What are the long-term outcomes with how adults are likely to behave towards others, especially outside of the family?
Well, that is beyond my area of expertise, but I will take a stab at it. The expectations that Mayans have for their kids is that they approximate the way adults interact with each other. So in fact, the Maya kids are just being brought into the adult world as they are competent to do so. Family is very important. Family obligations are very important. Family socializing is very important. So and work is very important. Contributing to work, volunteering to work, those are all adult values as well. And having autonomy. So all three of those things that I have said are organizing the child's world reflect primary principal values of the adult world. So the kids are just slowly brought in to be able to be competent in the world that is around them. That's very different than in what we were talking about a minute ago, kids being isolated in their play bubble, in their unreality bubble, and then eventually they have to come out of that bubble. A lot of research in the last decade has been for American families, how that bubble is just lasting longer and longer, up to age 30 sometimes, that we are forgiving young adults a lot of responsibility. We're letting them, I see Eddie's head is bouncing up and down, we are just extending the length of time that the kids are in that bubble. And 50 years ago, historically, they weren't in a bubble like that, maybe ever. But it's a new phenomenon in our culture. And it shows a discontinuity with what it is that they'll have to do as adults. What they learn to do as kids is different. And then they have to relearn something. And that's one reason why adolescence is as painful in this society as it is. It's a shifting of gears as opposed to a continuous progression. And Benedict called that continuity and discontinuity in socialization.
Yeah. Kate.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hello, Kate.
Thank you for a great talk. I was doing 40 instead of 30 because I know some people who are on their way to
I
being
see.
40 and
I see.
are
Yes.
still, in the nest. May always be in the nest.
40
So
is the new 30.
Yes. So we've talked a lot about these topics in the past, and I mean, I have a lot of ideas as I was listening to you talk. But one that we haven't talked about and that I was thinking about is you talked about belonging in both groups, but I'm wondering if the very notion of belonging is somewhat culturally relative, or if to what you are belonging is not the same thing. Like belonging is qualitatively different. I'm just thinking about the role of family in the US, especially middle-class US, even extended family. The idea that we use the word extended to talk about them. The great mobility of people. I don't live where I was born. I wasn't born when my parents were born. That idea that we don't have right next door people in our family or extended family. So thinking about belonging, could it possibly be that to what people are constituting belonging are very different kinds of phenomena?
Undoubtedly, for sure. I think, though, that, I mean, you wouldn't want to say that family is not important to US middle-class people, right? So it's not like they've rejected it. In some ways, it's like they've populated their world with many other commitments as well. And so perhaps there's a balance among them that is not present for this Maya community. It is, we don't know very much about how things work in small rural communities in the US. That has not been studied a lot. If you're living in the house that you grew up in, if you're living in your grandparents' house, if you have all of your relatives right next door, you're going to have some commitments to family that look very similar to this. So it's not only about culture, it is a lot about other sociological conditions. But I think that we teach our kids very young to have commitments outside the family and to have be highly valued. So early on, they are already have this bifurcated world of the world outside and the world inside that just really doesn't exist for this community. And I think that I'm guessing that in some rural communities that there is that bifurcation, perhaps not as strong. In the Maya community, you go to school with your brothers, your sisters, your cousins. There's almost always a relative in your class. So at break time, the kids often hang out with their relatives in class, even though they're at school with a whole bunch of other kids. And that might extend to, like, my cousin has a different cousin, so I'll hang out with that cousin too. Or is that a second cousin? But undoubtedly there are differences. I think if the woman who talked about needing her own time outside the family is a good example, right? That adult is used to not having family obligations 100% of the time. They are used to they're compartmentalized. So it's not that she isn't committed to her family. She's committed to her family in the evenings. She's not committed to her family 24/7. Whereas the Maya mothers the world is their space. And that's populated with family members, and the obligations and responsibilities and what you get back from all of those people is just part of life. It's like a safety net underneath their world that I don't think Americans have. But we did ask parents who they were getting support from. And the Maya mothers said that they were getting their support primarily from family members, and a few said from neighbors. But American mothers said their colleagues at work, their neighbors, people in social groups that they belonged to, as well as their families. So they had, in a sense, a wider network of people to give them support. But it was in part because they spend their time in different networks.